Well, good afternoon to all. My panelists are walking in, so they are the important people in this session. Let me just say a few words by way of introduction. Resilience, etymologically, means bouncing back. And one has to wonder, why do we need the capacity to bounce back after compression? And I think there are many reasons. In this conference, we have learned that the word resilience should not be misused because we are living in a landscape of risks that is unprecedented. We have been invited to look at resilience from the point of view of inclusive finance. And I think you all have felt, I have felt, that putting the lens of resilience on inclusive finance adds a lot. It forces us to look at outcomes, not just to access, as Sophie was arguing yesterday. We have also, I think, although this is a small group of people that have a passion for financial inclusion, we're inviting the community of others involved in the agenda of resilience. Because this group believes that resilience can be an indispensable piece in resilience agendas, and that ministers of finance, central bank governors, should have inclusive finance in the radar screen as they confront the resilience problem. And we have also, I think, come to the realization that it's difficult to integrate the different players in the quest for resilience for many reasons. Different professions, different specialties, silo effects. And it's even more difficult to align the incentives of the public and private sector to achieve goals. So the purpose of this panel is to see if we can make some progress, at least in the thinking on how to best work to align the incentives of public and private sector in this intersection between inclusive finance and resilience. For that, we have a fantastic panel. We have 4 players, important players in different levels of this field. First, we have Nigel Clark, who has had a fantastic career in policy making in Jamaica, and now he has the challenge of being the second in command at the IMF, the deputy managing director of the IMF. He will bring a perspective of the IMF. You know what these guys are. They are the systemic guys, the macro guys. We need them. But sometimes we feel them a little bit distant. So we have brought Nigel to be close to this community. We'll also have in the panel Peter Jacobs, who is the CEO of ING, a very powerful commercial bank here in the Netherlands. And that is the other side, pure private sector. Then we have the CEO of FinTech, André, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, Simons. She is the CEO, global CEO of FinTech, a network of microfinance institutions and FinTechs. And we also have with us Pradeep, and I am very afraid of pronouncing his last name. But Pradeep, if I may, I'll just use your first name. Okay. So he brings a special perspective because he's in the bridge between public policy and private sector. He is the executive secretary for the UN Capital Development Fund. And so he's there in the business of crowding in the private sector for these good objectives. So this will be a fantastic conversation. So I would like to invite the panel to come and take your seats here, and then we will begin. Hi, how are you? All right, let's begin. I think it is important to begin with the IMF. So Nigel, let me ask you a question, and you can take it however you want. I have to warn you guys that you have 5 minutes for each answer. I'm not sure if I am a good master of time, but we have here our moderator with electrodes. The first question for Nigel. Could you elaborate on your thoughts on the link between building resilience in the low-income segments of society, small companies, and getting resilience at a macro level, at a societal level? How do you see this bidirectional interaction?
Thank you, and pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. There is a profound relationship between resilience at the macroeconomic level and resilience at the micro and individual and small business level. And I can sort of share examples from my experience as Minister of Finance in Jamaica. For decades, Jamaica struggled with high unemployment, high poverty rates, high inflation. Unemployment averaged 20% between the early 1970s and the end of the 1980s. It averaged 15% between the 1990s all the way up to the middle of the 2000s. Inflation double-digit for every single year over 40 years, with the exception of 1 or 2. It wasn't until we were able to restore macroeconomic stability after decades of instability, and not only restore it, but entrench it as measured by stable prices, stable debt trajectory, stable financial sector, sufficient reserves in our central bank. And voila, we ended up with the lowest unemployment rate in our history, obviously steadily, below 4%. Unbelievable if you grew up in Jamaica or you knew Jamaica in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And as you would expect, our poverty rate also declined to the lowest level in our entire history. So all of the other strategies and having people come in and help, without the macro stabilization, poverty was still up here. And the reason why poverty is up here is that the ability of the poor and the vulnerable to absorb shocks and respond to them and recover from them is limited. Yeah? So that is the relationship between the macro channeling to help the micro. Now, in the other direction, the more resilient individuals are, is the more likely they are to be a part of the formal system, which also helps with domestic resource mobilization. Exactly. And domestic resource mobilization enables a country to be able to respond to the needs of its citizenry, and thereby helping to stabilize the country. And also, the more resilient a population is the more you can rely on institutionalized mechanisms of social support, as opposed to the one-off, the ones that you don't plan. Right? There's a crisis and there's no institutional response, and you have to make something up that has the impact of on your budget. So the more resilient the population is the more the government is able to plan and to keep stable finances. So there is, and I think I'm just on my limit here, there is a two-way relationship between resilience at the level of the state and resilience at the level of the individual.
Yes, I think that has been well established. Peter, you had a profit-oriented institution. What is it in for the private sector to search for resilience?
No, I think that's so. Indeed, I'm the CEO here in this country, in the Netherlands, and where financial inclusion is perhaps not the biggest priority, financial health is. And the question becomes, why is it to society and why is it to the bank? I think that, we live in a great place, people are quite happy, but if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Index, the Netherlands is only, I think, the 25th country today. So there is a bit of a conclusion that we enjoy today a bit more than that we invest in tomorrow. And I think that with a few $100 billion on the balance sheet, I think a bank takes decisions about whom to invest, where the credit flows, what to do with colleagues and people and society. So you see that at least we have a bit of a purpose. Let's see what we can do. But we're not an NGO. And I think that very often there is a bit of a misconception that the moment you care about financial health, you care about financial inclusion, that it is always at the expense of your own profitability. But if we look at the United Nations definitions of financial health, and we look at resilience, we look at about not spending more than you earn, we look about sustainable debt, we think about insurance and pensions and planning for later, then eventually we're seducing people to save a bit more and to not overcredit themselves. Well, I can tell you, both are quite profitable to a bank. Because if people save a bit more and they put it on our balance sheet, we do make 50 basis points. So for us, financial health is not the biggest topic in terms of generating money, but at least there is no trade-off. And I think it's a misconception for banks that there is a trade-off between financial health and the shareholder value. In the end, you don't make money on loans that people should not have had. It only costs you money. And I think that helping people to save a bit more and to become a bit more resilient, I think is an excellent way for both the customer, society, and the bank.
Absolutely. This idea of prudent lending has appeared in this conference often. You know, if we want to empower people and make them more resilient, you just don't want to over-indebt them, because that will make them even more vulnerable. So having banks that do this.
So small symptoms. So we basically started to look at our customer behavior, and for groups of customers, we did some macroeconomic research about their financial health. And we have a nice model that tracks it. Are they stressed, or are they vulnerable, or coping, or healthy? And then you start to also look at client behavior. You just start to look at how often does a healthy client call the call center versus stressed customer. Where are the risk costs? Where are the costs for arrears? So also in the way that you serve your customers, you're going to see that your costs explode for those people who are stressed in life. Yep. And so I think that's not only, so I think it's a misconception that you can't do good without being profitable. I think it serves both, and it gives me a conviction that we can scale even further.
Perfect. Andre.
Yes.
Now you are in the field of microfinance and those institutions. Yesterday we were having an interesting conversation, and you used the word scaling up.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you can elaborate on that. What do you see as the next step in your network of institutions to scale up, to reach, to tailor your products?
So just to be completely clear, I was asked, what do I need from the public sector in order to scale up? And I'm going to use my 5 minutes to elaborate on that.
All right.
But before I do that, just to tell you all a little bit about Finca. And I do feel like this is a very consequential moment in the history of development. And so I'm deeply grateful to Sophie, to the whole team at CGAP for inviting me to speak on behalf of the microfinance practitioners. So Finca operates in 40 countries around the world. We've been in operations for 40 years. The bulk of what we do is, in fact, microcredit. We have asked our customers what they need from us, and they've said they want to be able to generate a better income, they want to be more resilient, and they want to be able to access education for themselves and for their children. We serve 80% self-employed people who are self-employed out of necessity. There's no formal employment that's actually available to them. And over the history of our organization, we've mobilized $500 million in philanthropic capital and investment to lend $16 billion around the world. We know a lot about what our customers actually need. But I want to tell you about one woman in particular because I think she's sort of emblematic. I'll tell you about a woman in the Democratic Republic of Congo. On my last trip to Kinshasa, I met her. She sells livestock in the marketplace. She sells pigs. She uses the proceeds from her livestock income to build rooms that she lets out. And her goal is to be able to build enough rooms that when she physically can no longer work in the market, she has enough passive income in order to survive. So she's incredibly resilient. She's incredibly intelligent. What she needs is access to cheaper capital in a way that lines up better with her business. And she also needs some education. She's illiterate, and so and she only has a USSD phone. So there's a role for us to play in also delivering that education. So what do we need in order to scale up services to women like her and men who are in the same circumstances around the world? We need three things. We need better technology. So most microfinance institutions, not all of them, but most of them are actually relatively small. They can't afford the technology stack that would really enable them to be much more efficient and to be much more flexible in the products that they deliver. So I've heard a lot of people saying we're not innovating enough, but the reality is that most of us don't have the technology that allows us to innovate. So we need to implement that technology. Funnily enough, very few funders are actually interested in paying for it. And that's mostly because the cost benefit of putting a full technology stack into a small institution that's focused on a less lucrative segment isn't very good. So we have to find a different way to do that. And waiting for DPI in the markets that we operate in is a long wait. And it still doesn't solve the institutional technology needs. So we as an organization are actually building a shared platform that we can use across our institutions that won't require each of them to have the technology know-how in order to manage them. Increasingly, you know, product and technology are one and the same. And we don't want to leave people behind. We want to make sure that our customers actually have these flexible products that directly line up with their needs and that they're priced in line with what that customer's risk actually is. And so that technology investment is necessary. For us to get that, we obviously need investment, but also we need support from regulators for testing and innovation, for taking on some new ways of doing business. We also need the ability to use non-local vendors, to use cloud computing, to be able to do offshore data analytics, to have sandboxes, and we need to not pay a 40% withholding tax on payments for services that are outside of the country because it just increases the cost radically and we can't afford that. The second thing that we need is risk appetite for innovation. So many microfinance institutions really can't afford to innovate because they're operating on such thin margins. They can't take the risk. We're actually a lot like our customers in some ways. So customers have 3 really small businesses. They never invest a lot of money in one of them because they know that if they do, they risk losing it all. So they have these little different streams. MFIs are very similar to that. We actually don't want to take any risk on something that's going to potentially put us out of business. And so we need support in taking those risks in a calculated way that will allow us to drive that innovation. And then the last thing, which is the biggest pain point, is the cost of funds. So it costs FINCA 28% to borrow in local currency in Zambia. It costs us 17% to borrow in Uganda. The fact is that we need a lot more local currency in order to make effective loans. The costs of hedging are incredibly high. And we need to get commercial banks, local commercial banks, off the sidelines. Guarantee facilities, as great as they are, don't actually move the needle very much with local commercial banks. And so I think that's where the public sector can play a tremendous role in helping to push the private sector financial actors into providing social impact funding. That's it from me for now.
This is fantastic. You have raised a question that has been in my mind many times, and I'm sure others in these institutions have thought. Local currency funding is a huge challenge. It is not too difficult to get dollar funding or euro funding, but local currency funding is important. And if you don't fund yourself in local currencies, you will incur mismatches that may become very dangerous for institutions. So there might be something that the international community can do about it. But let me go to Pradeep. Now, you are right in the middle, bridging the initiatives in the private sector with what risk absorption capacity or coordination capacity institutions like the UN have. So could you give us a sense of what are the mechanisms to align incentives and to crowd in the private sector into reaching out and going to the frontier?
Sure, thank you. First of all, I feel like a bit of an imposter sitting next to you, but it's really thankful to Sophie for putting us on the panel with this group. Look, I think earlier you used the analogy, it takes a village to do things. I think I'm the villager that has been underutilized in that village, and I'll explain why. We have been part of CGAP for so many years, but I'm pretty sure none of you actually knew the full capability of UN Capital Development Fund. It's just mind-boggling to me. This is a 60-year-old organization, the only UN platform that was mandated by the General Assembly to deploy, back in 1966, a loan instrument at 0% or very low interest. Think about it. 1966, what was happening around then? And why on earth did the General Assembly come up with a UN institution with this capability against a run of play with the Bretton Woods institutions, right? And I think there's an explanation for all of that. Obviously, it lost back in 1966. It was never used that way. But now you have the benefit of hindsight, FFD4, and you've exposed essentially the bottleneck in the system. And you've all talked about it. Now, the magic of UNCDF is that it's a public institution. It's a UN platform based on grants, operating in local currency at the national level and subnational level, with the capability to deploy guarantees against a balance sheet it does not protect. Think about it. It allows risk absorption in a way that very few institutions can effect. It provides liquidity. It's good enough that the systems are about to be pillar assessed by the EU Gateway, the EFSD Plus, for the deployment of guarantees. It's effectively a market-creating platform. Right? It was always meant to operate, to go right to the bottom, build on the grants that are in place, and actually lift the bottom up and create the kind of ecosystem that the larger DFIs, MDBs, and commercial actors that can then come in, because the risk profile has fundamentally changed. It's about deepening the financial sector. Because without deepening the financial sector, you can't help countries move away from aid dependence. It's as plain as that. And now I think with ODA declining, you have no choice but to go here, right? So in many ways, I feel like the time of UNCDF, it took 60 years and better late than never, but it's time to start making use of this platform, right? So the advantage I think that we bring is really in a world where, 4% of the nearly $500 trillion of global assets makes its way to developing countries, and a fraction of that makes it into LDCs, to places like Congo, DRC. I think there's a reason for it. It's because we've been trying to transact on platforms that cannot absorb risks. And unless you are able to bring these capabilities together, the village bands together in many ways, then that's when you start seeing the magic happen. So I came in 14 months ago with a reform agenda. I came to UNCDF after 20 years with UNDP and 6 years with the World Bank. And I'm telling you, this is absolutely needed in the ecosystem out there.
This is, I think, music to our ears. I remember I once wrote a paper on risk absorption by the public sector, and I was puzzled to find out that multilateral development banks and other type of institutions are very risk averse. They are unwilling to absorb risk. They don't even know how to do that. Yeah. They consider themselves preferred creditors, and they ride on that, and they don't want to take risk. So it's fantastic that you are talking about a certain intelligent capacity to absorb risk that can complete some markets and bring in the private sector.
Just to make the point, mentioned guarantees are difficult to work. I agree with you if those guarantees are on a AAA-rated platform. But if you have a donor-funded, fully funded guarantee, against a platform where you're willing to take the risk, it's almost like you're still providing a AAA-rated product to the market, but you're willing to absorb the risk. Exactly. So you go to places others would not. It's as simple as that. So this is why I think, by joining the dots, there's a lot more that can happen, and we become effectively off-balance sheet de-risker to you.
Yes. Well, let's continue to join the dots. Let me now go to you. You mentioned that you need some things from regulators, some tolerance, etc. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on what you see the hurdles and obstacles in getting the alignment of public policy with private incentives.
So I've been doing a lot of reflecting on that lately. And I guess I'll start by saying the first thing is an acknowledgement that we haven't actually found the answer. Because I think there's a predilection to wanting a sure thing. We were talking about that. But also not wanting to take risk. And the fact is, the only way that we're going to get there is if we experiment. And then we share the results of those experiments. And in some ways, even though right now feels very heavy for those of us that are focused on development, I am a glass half full person. I think it's a great time to reevaluate how we've worked together. And Pradeep, you talked about partnering. I actually think that the most important thing, what we can do to really drive this dialogue forward, is to develop much deeper partnerships. And I've had some wonderful partnerships, and the key thing that has defined them being great is a shared accountability for the result and a shared accountability for the risk. When it's one-sided, it doesn't work very well. People see themselves as managers and doers, and really there needs to be a much more visionary approach to testing and to sharing and then to adapting as we learn, as opposed to having rigid goals. So I think that's the first. The second is that there's also an opportunity for us to broaden our community to be more successful. Sophie, bringing everybody here together in this room to talk about resilience is a wonderful start, and it's been, I think, for a lot of us, really uplifting. But the fact is that there are people that should be in this community that aren't. The stakeholders that we have on the ground, whose needs we're really trying to meet, the leaders of the communities that we're working with, and the philanthropists in the local countries that also, I think, have an interest in driving that progress forward. And so I know that may sound soft, but I really don't think that it is. We need to be more intentional about bringing all of our stakeholders together at the beginning of our initiatives and designing initiatives that are actually wanted, as opposed to taking things that we know work in one place and transposing them into other places where they might not necessarily be as effective. I talked about the cost of funds, so I won't belabor that again, although I'm tempted. But I also think that we really do need to, all of us, give up some of our power and our agency. I think we're actually bearing the consequences of not including community in a lot of what's happening around the world today. And so part of that community and the definition of community means that you are sharing in the cost and the outcomes. And for us as individual institutions, we're frequently incentivized to fund our work. But really, we have one goal, which is to improve humanity. And I don't think that it is a bad thing to acknowledge that that's why we're here. And I don't think that it diminishes our interest in excellence. I actually think that it amplifies it. So we as a group of people who are committed to this need to cede some of our agency in order to be more successful and create more shared platforms. We haven't been good at that in the past, but I think now is a wonderful time to try again.
Great. Peter, let me come to you now. But let me see if I can push you a little bit more on. I really am attracted to the idea of financial health. I think it's a much more powerful concept than financial inclusion, because health encompasses inclusion, but not the other way around. So could you tell us a little bit, what do you guys do in the bank to advance this financial health agenda? Do you have some examples you want to share with us?
Very happy to share with you. So we came to the conclusion that if I would have to rewrite the word ESG, and of course it's not up to me, but let's assume that I would have to do it, I would have not called it ESG, but I would have started with a G and then the S and then the E. I'm a very strong believer that decent organizations make a society resilient, and the resilience is needed to actually undergo the kind of transition that we all face today. And so the question is, what can you do as a bank to have financial health to strengthen society? First of all, we started to come up with a bit of a measurement score. And this is not on every individual, but at least on the populations. And let me explain you very simply why and what we do. We looked at the UN, we stated, don't spend too much, make sure that you're a bit financially resilient, don't overcredit yourself, and plan for later. What can we do to actually measure that in the bank? And then we started to look, so we came up with 5 metrics along these 4 pillars. So on the first pillar, don't spend too much, we had 2 metrics. On the other ones, we each have 1 metric. Let me give you a very simple example. In the Netherlands, people use a lot direct debits. So we started to look, if in a full year people have more than 8 times a direct debit that fails, then we know that's not that healthy. If it's somewhere between 3 and 8, it's okay. And if it's less than 3 times, it was a mistake, then that's sound. So we give you either 2 points, 1 point, or 0 points. If you did it on 5 metrics, then you end up with a score between 0 and 10. And that's not a coincidence, because in Dutch high schools, you always get a grade between 0 and 10. And the first 3 numbers, then you're stressed. 4 and 5, you're basically vulnerable. And then you're coping, and then you're healthy. And why is this model so beautiful for us? Then we started to look at all our propositions and started to answer 3 questions. Question number 1 is, how many people use this proposition? You don't need a model for that, but at least it's still good to understand. Secondly, of all the people who use this proposition, did it now land with my target audience? Is this proposition now used by stressed people or only by healthy people? And thirdly, if you look at stressed people who, for example, start to use one of those propositions, and you compare them to people who don't use it, and you track them for 12 months, do we now start to recognize that there is basically an improvement in financial health score? And I'll give you 2 examples. The first example is automatic savings. To seduce people to automatically, in the beginning of the month, first think of themselves by putting a small fee on their own savings account, before they start to do all kind of other stuff, has phenomenal impact. Yeah. Statistically, we can prove the impact on stress level, on healthy people, on everyone. The problem is a bit that the majority of the people who do this are not the stressed people. So there you come to the conclusion, the product worked, but our campaigning and marketing, we need to improve. We also introduced round up and save. Basically, if you have your debit card, you always round up and it goes automatically to your savings account. Yes. You know, we spent quite a bit of money, great media campaign, a lot of people use it, but the problem is no impact. So we have to do product redevelopment. I still don't know why. We have to see whether the account is perhaps not sticky enough, or I don't know, whatever happens. Perhaps people feel even incentivized to pay even more because they think that they save more. But we have to, but then you start to see it's product development. So at least we've made sure that for all the propositions we have, we start to understand basically, does it reach a target audience and is there a positive impact on financial health? But that gives you a bit of a flavor.
That's fantastic, and the use of data that is now possible allows you to advance at the fastest pace.
I also wanted to make a very small comment on the government and the relation that we have. And so in a big sense, I love regulation. It has brought us quite far, and it's very good, but there are also some downsides, and at least in the domain of financial inclusion, I see them. If you look at financial health in the Netherlands, then you start to see that sometimes I would hope that there is a bit more regulation at certain elements like online gambling, like buy now, pay later. You know, it's just terrible. You know, whatever online gambling is just a very good way to lose your full resilience. Yes. Okay, and of course it's very difficult. That can only happen through regulation, but that's a bit of a given. But what amazed me yesterday, also listening to the speech of Sophie and looking at the blockades and the 1.5 billion people, to some extent I feel that also bringing banking to areas where there is insufficient banking today, that it becomes more difficult than it ever was. For the simple reason, credit risk is very important, but also listening to the UN, we have now some instruments that really help. But for a bank like ING, these days, perhaps it's not even credit risk. After 9/11, we started to see that there is an enormous scrutiny to prevent terrorism financing. We started to see that in Europe, you know, to basically fight for money laundering, and then with the war in Ukraine, the sanction list, that means that the entire AML is so big that if people would ever tell me, Peter, why don't you also bring your digital services to a community that could use them? Yeah, it's so scary to bring banking propositions from one area where they seem to work to another area where you don't understand how to do it. And I think that's basically these retail propositions, and also with the liabilities and the savings money, is almost a prerequisite to do the financing in the local currency. So there is a bit of how can we do that? And,
much more conversation is needed with the regulators so that they hit the sweet spot, which is not the same for every place, every region, and every.
Perhaps regulators trusting each other. You know, I can tell you, if you the amount of account teams that I have from the European Central Bank, obviously doing a fantastic job in regulating me, then that might be good enough for another regulator. But now you know that this is so big that you think.
Point well taken. Nigel, let me come back to you. In my Columbia class, I always showed to my students this global paradox, that there is this incredible amount of loanable funds in the world, gigantic amount. And there is an incredible amount of needs in populations, particularly in the developing part of the world. And we have a hard time bringing them together. So I want to ask you, Nigel, do you have some thoughts on what can be done to make it easier to connect the two sides of the market, the needs and this amazing amount of funding in the world that's looking where to go but doesn't go to where we need it to go?
Yes, that's a good question. I'll come back to where I ended in the last question, which is the role that macroeconomic stability plays, even in developing countries, to create the environment that's conducive to investment. At the end of the day, capital wants a return. And I mean, where is capital more likely to get a return? In a country that's bedeviled by foreign exchange shortages, runaway inflation, debt crisis, or in a country that has stable finances that can weather economic or natural disaster shocks, that has enough foreign exchange reserves, etc. So that is a foundation that I would argue the development space does not pay as much attention to as it should. And I guess that's why I'm here.
Yeah,
so let me
exactly.
use my soapbox for a little bit. Stabilization is a friend of the poor. But it's the politics of poverty, as my prime minister likes to, or former prime minister likes to say, that is the problem, where interest groups who are vested in a status quo will always project their own fears of loss of privilege in a way that transforms it into being something that affects the poor. So let's use a couple of examples. Fuel subsidies, which are, fuel subsidies are the biggest example of this politics of poverty. Oh, we put fuel subsidies in because we want to help the poor. And if you reduce it, oh, he's against the poor. He wants to help. Well, fuel subsidy, who consumes the most fuel? Most fuel is consumed by higher income groups. Where does a larger proportion of fuel subsidies go? They go to higher income groups. I had to face that as finance minister in Jamaica during the inflation crisis. Governments around the world, including in the developed world, were rolling back taxes on fuel because they wanted to help the poor. Well, give me a break. That's the worst way to help the poor. You're helping the rich, actually. And what you should do is have a targeted approach, right? And not use the revenue side of the ledger, but use the expenditure side of the ledger and target the people who need it most. And I believe if we can get a little more macro stabilization language in a development agenda, I think we would accomplish a lot more.
Exactly.
Now, coming back to, so you definitely need stabilization or stable economies that attract capital, but you also need well-structured projects. We had experience again in Jamaica where we were trying to bring capital to a public-private partnership with an airport that we wanted to, government didn't have the funds to spend to expand it, to keep abreast with international regulation, so it wanted to transfer to private ownership and have the private sector make the capital investment. The bid was, 14 people took the bid documents. The deadline was 4 o'clock on a particular day. 3 o'clock, no bids. 3:59, no bids. 4 o'clock, no bids at all. This was in a previous government, by the way, not mine. We got in. The warning was, do not touch that. Do not touch that. You're going to be embarrassed. You saw what happened just last year. So, so okay, all right. What we did, we commissioned a survey to go to the investor and say, why didn't you bid? And they came back and they gave feedback. And then we incorporated that feedback. And what they said was, look, you wanted us to pay you upfront and then pay you something. And I said, look, the asymmetry of the information is such that if we pay you up front and you're gone and we have this asset and it doesn't return, that's too much risk for us to take. So when we came to do it again under our turn, we aligned interests by not asking for something up front, but by saying, look, the bid amount is the percentage of revenues you're going to give the government. So we're aligned with you. If the airport does well, the government gets paid, they get paid, and vice versa. And we ended up with 13 high-quality bids. It reminds me of the parable in the, if I may use, in the Bible with, taking the net from one side and moving it, with no fish and the fish were there. Okay. So structuring transactions in a way that's sensitive to risk appetite is critical in attracting capital. The capital is there. It will even come and take the documents up, but it will not come forward if you don't have the stabilization or stable economies and your transactions are not well structured. And well structured transactions means, or getting there means having on your team people who are proper intermediaries and who are in touch with investor communities and then listening to them.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Breaking this information asymmetry to breaking the structure.
Yes, the information asymmetry. And the story has a happy ending in the sense that what we are able to do after we successfully did this PPP, where interests were aligned, we are able to do a securitization transaction, a non-recourse securitization transaction, totally non-recourse, meaning just this asset, where our share of the revenues, we're able to go to the market and get it up front. And you know what? The amount that we were able to get up front was multiples.
Yes. So you got the money up
front?
front?
Order of 10.
Yes.
From what was being asked in the first place.
Super interesting.
And we couldn't have done that if we didn't have the long-term stability. Are you following me?
Yes.
That is absolutely key. And if one thing that I can leave with the minds of everybody here today is that the development and resilience world paying attention to macro stability is absolutely crucial.
There you go. The role of the IMF. It's the right one. It's the right one. So as I go to Pradeep in this next question, I want you all to think a little bit, because at the end I want you to give reflections as a feedback to each other. But Pradeep, you perhaps have a good sense of how we could develop a measurement system or ideas on how to measure the progress that may be made in this aligning the capacities of the public sector, like the UN Capital Development Fund and the private risk takers. Do you have any idea how we can set up kind of a rating system that allows us to see progress in that direction?
No, look, I'm not sure I have a lot to say on that. I do think that there's a lot that needs to be done, which requires, the likes of the four of us and others to come together in a way that we have not done before, right? I mean, we barely scratched the surface on it. I can reflect on it for the last 25 years that I've been active in this space. I mean, it's been infrequent that we connect our capabilities in the way that it needs to. Either someone, a UNDP would go in and do a grant play expecting an MDB or DFI to come behind it. They don't turn up. If an MDB goes ahead looking for, grant money to do the TA de-risking, that's not available. It takes another 7 years to unlock it. You need local currency. You're paying, out of your nose to get that in place when you don't have to, and you shouldn't. So all of this requires such fundamental foundational work to be done. And I think, if anything, what's going on in the world today with declining ODA, it's requiring all of us to rethink how we do business. And that, I think, is a game changer. And the fact is that little steps do result in big change. I mean, Kenya, I'll give you an example. Kenya has a huge issue with food waste at the farm. Nearly 70% of the crops are wasted. Now, you scratch your head and say, well, come on, why hasn't somebody invested in cold chain storage? And the answer is, well, it's too risky. So when we go along to Kenya and we put in a $10 million guarantee to a local bank, they're then able to open up their balance sheet to lend to developers who come in and start creating cold chain storage. You're reducing food waste at the farm and you're increasing incomes of the farmers almost immediately, right? But it just required someone to go in there and take that risk, right? It then enables, you now have a de-risked environment. Tanzania, the Tanga Municipal Authority issued a water bond. I'm not sure any of you have heard of it. With about $1 million of investment from us, they raised the equivalent of $20 million of local currency for investment in 2 water projects. That wasn't even the magic. The magic was they then cross-listed that in the local stock exchange and then later in Luxembourg, right? So there is also a reality here that there are perceived risks that we need to manage, we need to get over, and I think it's really important, as much as we need to get the macroeconomic stability in place, we need to also go and show some quick wins right at the bottom. Because I think it's when that happens, that the two interface with each other, you are really able to move forward. So, I think, the metrics are important, and we need to figure out how to do that. And, there are ways in which you can build off the work that has already been done, including on the, pathways, platform that CGAP has built up. But I do think there's a lot more foundational steps that we need to do, we need to tread, and that's where I hope we can see some progress very quickly.
Yes, but that requires a focus on impact rather than on the input. Many of our organizations count the inputs, not the impact. So many people would say, you put a 10 million guarantee. For me, that's not a relevant number. The relevant number is how much you saved over time with a cold storage facilities.
See that happening, right? And it should be sufficient for us to then measure those kinds of metrics and then talk about how that translates into job creation, into economic activity at the local level. And those kinds of metrics are important. They're not nearly half as well collected as they should be.
Exactly.
So some of those things really do require attention as well, for sure.
Good. Let's go for a round of final reflections. Shall we start with you? You have 1.5 minutes each, or you can use it all or not. But
okay. That was a hint to not use it all, I think. So I want to go back to the opening session. We were talking about the population boom that's going to happen in Africa, the fact that there are simply not enough jobs that are going to be created. And so we have to figure out a way to get the volume of capital to self-employed entrepreneurs to help them to create their own jobs. And my reflection, I guess, is that I really do believe that we have the brains in the room to be able to come up with more creative financing solutions. I take your point about really being attuned to understanding the other side's needs. But that means we all have to come together and actually figure out how we're going to make it work. And I think for the development community overall, really, I think that we need to focus on a smaller number of initiatives and join forces on actually demonstrating a much more significant impact through those initiatives and then replicating that, hopefully.
Okay.
No, so if I reflect a bit on the discussion, I think that financial inclusion, financial health is obviously super, super important. What I like most is that at least my takeaway is, for me personally, that there is no trade-off between basically financial health and profitability of private companies like banks. I think that having 13 proposals for financing an airport is a fantastic example on where you see that it actually works. I think that also you mentioning, guys, make sure that you are a bit stable and that you're predictable and that you have a decent, then the money will come. And for those where people might have those stable projects but still are a bit concerned, we see that indeed your point about we are happy to then basically underwrite and take out some of those additional risks to help people over the hurdle to get there. I think that is the kind of collaboration that's going to help us. So,
Good.
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, it's very simple, particularly in terms of addressing poverty and reducing it. For me, you need to start with market creation. And the reality is that, many of the countries where, we have this issue, it's not the case that these countries are the same as they were 40, 50 years ago. They're very different. Go to Kenya today. I mean, I lived in Kenya in the 1990s. I went there after nearly 10 years last month. I mean, your mind explodes. Like, what happened here? So there are opportunities that we have to leverage, but there must be risk-absorbing capital that's made available, and there's too little of it. I mean, let's just be honest, there isn't. This is why we keep talking about a missing middle. You have lots of finance or microfinance, you have the huge ticket sizes, but in between, this is what is needed for those countries where the bedrock of the economy is SMEs, MSMEs. We got to try and figure out a way to crack this, and I think collectively in this room, the power is here, right? We just need to bring it together in a way that it hasn't been done before. Make the impossible possible.
Yes.
And for the pool of countries that we're speaking about, resilience is absolutely critical because developing countries, small countries, by definition, are vulnerable to economic shocks, commodity shocks, natural disaster shocks, financial condition shocks, etc. And it is the ability to recover from shocks that makes the difference. And I give you the example of Jamaica again. In the oil price shocks of the mid-1970s and the social dislocation that came from that, it took 14 years
To bounce back.
for Jamaica's GDP in real terms, after it declined in 1976, to 1976, yes, to get back to the 1975 level. After the global financial crisis, it took 11 years from 2008, when the economy declined in 2008, and then in 9, and then in 10. It took 11 years until 2019 to surpass 2007 or 2008 GDP. When COVID came, the mother or the father or the parent of all shocks, because we had resilience in the form of buffers, and we had reserves, and we had stability, and we had fiscal room and space, etc., we were able to recover pre-COVID GDP within 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay? And as a result, unemployment was a downward trajectory. Before COVID, it was a record low at 7%. Never before Jamaica had unemployment at 7%. During COVID, it shot up to 10, 11%. But because of the recovery, it resumed its downward within, even before the GDP numbers came up, within 2 years, and came back down. And that resilience improves people's lives. And I'll give you at the business level as well. Jamaica being a tourism-dependent country, when a shock hits, people lose their jobs. And in this particular shock, as we know, the tourist sector was decimated. We found a way, because this was a newly class of vulnerable people, they were not in an vulnerability database before, but found a way to get resources to them by them signing up on electronic platforms through their phone. But what we did was to route the resources through the companies to ensure that the companies were in touch with them. Because what would happen, I don't know if anybody's familiar with what happened with the cruise industry. After COVID, I mean, today the cruise industry is not even half of what it was, even in 2025, because the workforce completely dissipated, right? And they could not get them back. We are able to provide resources to keep people going during COVID. And as a result, as soon as it passed, the industry was able to come back, and we had, bumper tourism for a couple of years after COVID. We were able to get the people back. And that's an example of people being resilient during a crisis, how that ultimately feeds back and helps the country.
Perfect. Borrowing from physics, resilience is the ability of materials to get back their original shape after being compressed. And I think the speed with which you go back matters, and I think that's the point you make at all levels: governments, fiscal positions, financial systems, poor households, small enterprises. I think this has been a fascinating panel. I want to thank you all for this, and I think we're perfectly on time. So thank you.